every single person is mentally and emotionally and physically capable of giving condolences, consolation that is meaningful. You don't have to be an expert. You have to be brave enough to reach out immediately. Put your own reservations aside. Oh, I'm too embarrassed. Well, what do I care more about? Saving face or helping my friend and potentially looking stupid? Anyone can make a huge difference by showing up and revealing their heart. I can't even imagine how hard this is. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to Death Discourse. I'm Rick Beeman, and today we're here talking with Dana Lacy Amarisa on her book, The Condolences Pocket Guide. What to say what to say and what not to say to grievers. And so, welcome, Dana. How are you?
Thanks, Rick. I'm great. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, that's fantastic. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, I had a series of losses when in the year 2000, in a 20-month period, I lost my infant daughter of 13 days. And then 7 months later, my dad passed away. And then about a year later, we lost our 8-month-old son. He had just started to crawl. So Zoe and Jake were my children. And when we lost our daughter, I was so struck by how the condolences seemed to hurt as much as the loss itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I wished I had a little book where I could have 50 of them in a basket by the door. And as people left, I could say, why don't you take one of those on your way out? Because I needed something that would explain me and what I needed at a time when I couldn't explain anything. And mid-sentence, I was telling my friend about the latest encounter in the grocery store and the latest really horrible thing that had been said to me. And mid-sentence, I realized I'm a writer, I'm a marketing writer, I'll write the book.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your grief and grief more generally. You write in the book that grief is actually more than grief, and I'm not sure what that means.
Well, most people think grief comes in this little sanitized package of 5 identifiable steps that you go in a certain order, and then when you're done, you go back to the way you were before. You pick up your life, you had this grieving process, but you're good to go. And grief affects more than just the person or thing you've lost. And it affects so much more than, oh, I'm sad about the loss of this thing. For me, for example, I didn't even know that in 13 days I had already pictured watching my daughter walk down the aisle to get married. And I lost 4 years of trying to have a baby. I lost all the hopes that we had for being a family of 3 and being parents. I lost motherhood. I lost my faith. I didn't want to lose my faith, but it was gone. I no longer could believe anything I believed before. I lost friends who couldn't deal with my grief. I lost the new mothers that I had met. We didn't have anything in common. And I lost something I could love that much. So what do I do with all that love? I grieve for the loss of the expression of my love.
As a person who wants to console or comfort a griever, What were some of the things that you found so distasteful or difficult to deal with when people with the best of intentions would say something to you?
Well, I think the best way to talk about that is to talk about vulnerability, because there's a vulnerability gap between the person who's grieving and the griever themselves. And one end of the spectrum, let's think corporate meeting, shields up, swords drawn. That's the most defended, not the most, but that's a very defended position we can find ourselves in the course of a normal life. On the other end of the spectrum, think about a griever. They've had all their social protections torn off. Their Klingon deflector shields are down, and they aren't coming back anytime soon. Now, it's fine to be defended. It's actually important to be defended to a certain extent, or we would take on we would feel all the pains of the world. Well, that is a griever's experience of life. They feel everything so acutely.
So it strikes me that as a griever, the way you've described it, it would be in physical terms a little like being a severe burn victim, in that
Yeah.
there's nothing you can do for a burn, medically speaking. You can try and take away some of the pain, but that exposed skin, and especially if it's a lot of it, one goes into agonizing pain just practically by looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
And it strikes me that's kind of what you're talking about with grief, that you're completely at the mercy of whatever environmental impact there is.
Yes.
And you're in pain just automatically, often.
Yes. I can, I could never tell from one minute to another or from one day to another how I was going to be. And when I woke up feeling good, it was a miracle. I had no idea what I did or didn't do to get there. And conversely, when I would have to rush out of the grocery store because I couldn't stop crying, I had no idea what I did.
So somebody sees you in the grocery store and wants to come up and trying to be caring.
Yes.
But somehow, tell me about that. What goes on?
Well, I could see it coming at 50 paces just by the people walking toward me, because it's what I did before I had suffered these losses. I would gird myself up and it's like, oh man, there she is. I got to say something to her. And it's like, okay, these are the condolences I know. I'll just say one of these. And so I would get tense myself because I knew I didn't know what I was doing. And so I learned to recognize that, and that goes to the lack of vulnerability. If that person had come up to me and said, I know I'm supposed to say something, but I don't know what it is. Everything seems really stupid to say, or just completely ineffective. I just want to let you know that I love you. That is vulnerability. So this book is not about wagging a finger. This book is saying we're all in the same boat, because none of us has been talked to about loss and about sharing from our hearts instead of our heads. Let's look at, there's four in my book. I talk about this gap, but I also have very practical lists of things that are helpful to say and things that are not helpful to say. And I've broken up the unhelpful condolences into 4 different types. There's question condolences, spiritual ideas, suggestions or advice, and pep talks or silver linings. So question condolences. How old was your daughter? Only 13 days? And that is a loaded, it's a loaded question. My husband and I did not lose our children to death. We lost our children to what's known as failed adoptions, which is a terrible term. And it was just outside the norm of a normal death that people didn't know that for us it was a death.
So you're saying the birth mother reclaimed the daughter after it had been adopted by you, or that during that 13-day period?
During that after 13 days, she changed her mind. But the problem is that goes to, this is still a painful loss for me, and it does not matter. And this is a perfect example of what's really important, even if we desperately want to know what happened. We know the person standing in front of us is crying their eyes out and is devastated, and that is enough to offer consolation. We can get the death details from someone else. But I was so often cut off and asked probing questions about, oh, well, that sounds like a legal problem. Did you know this could happen? That question says, well, you should have been prepared, and therefore you should not be crying, and I really don't want to hear your tears. So there's this whole area of losses that I learned from a hospice counselor that are called disenfranchised losses, or we were in disenfranchised grief. But it means that you're shuttled to the fringes of your culture. So in my case, I was shuttled to the fringes of the support network that I really thought I would have. I thought people would come rushing in to help me bear this. And when they didn't, it meant that I suffered a second loss, the loss of the support that I desperately needed in order to survive or move through this grieving and mourning period.
So when you talk about their guards being up, their guards can be up for any number of reasons, but one of them is judging the validity of your grief based on what caused the cause of your grief.
Yes, here's a perfect example. I'm going to show how I've said most of the things that I urge us not to say. I went to a friend's house and she was helping an acquaintance, a mutual acquaintance, who had lung cancer. And I said to him, "Oh my God, did you smoke?" Implicit in that is, well, if you did, you deserve what you got. And so I don't want to hear you cry about it. Or you should be ashamed of yourself for smoking. And as soon as those words came out of my mouth, this was after I lost my daughter, so I knew better. And it was already in my book. And even then, it still came out of my mouth. And I stopped myself and I said, oh my God, that's a terrible thing to say. If I had to do it again, I would say, I know there's a lot of people who smoke and they don't get lung cancer. I'm just sorry that you did. And I'm so sorry you're sick. And I can't even imagine what that experience is for you.
So by that example, we're going back to the very first thing not to say, or in those categories. That's a question. Oh my God, did you smoke?
Here's something to know about questions. Questions reveal nothing about me, except I want this information. I'm not telling you why or what I'm going to do with it, whether I'm going to judge you by it, whether I'm going to reassure myself that I can't get lung cancer or I can't get my baby taken away from me. And that is not vulnerable. And again, we're back to this gap between grievers and their friends and family. We're trying to close this gap. And the way to close the gap is to be vulnerable. Shooting out with a question, that's from up here. And it is already saying, I'm not going to tell you about myself. So often when I was asked, well, how long did you have her? I knew where they were going because everyone was going the same place. And it's like people wanting to say, well, at least you didn't get too close to her. You only had her such a short time. It's a good thing that you only had her such a short time. You didn't get so too close to her.
Now, what would you categorize that kind of?
That I would call the pep talk or silver linings. Anything that has at least, for example, let's see, when my dad died or when, someone else died, at least he didn't suffer.
Mm-hmm.
And what each of these is burdened with a whole bunch of other messages that the sayer is not seeing, but the griever is seeing. And in that case, at least he didn't suffer is saying, I need this not to be a terrible thing because I can't bear your tears and I can't bear the idea that you're suffering. And I need you to stop crying. Because if one were to think about it, I'm not crying because I'm worried about whether my dad is suffering or not. I'm crying because I miss my dad. So it doesn't matter
Mm-hmm.
whether he went fast, he went slow, he's no, I mean, are we going to get in an argument about whether he's suffering in the afterlife? I mean, that has no impact on, again, I have no one to love. I've known him my whole life.
Well, and by bringing that up, you go to another one, which is the spiritual category.
Yes. That also brings in the element of, at my most vulnerable point, when I cannot defend myself against you and your intrusion, you're going to weigh in on with your spiritual beliefs without asking me what I believe and without asking my permission. Well, there's one more spiritual one. God only gives us as much as we can handle.
Mm-hmm.
Besides the fact that if you look into the Bible carefully, that's not exactly what it says. But let's assume it does. That is a mandate for me to handle my grief. And how can I argue with you? You are telling me the voice of God. I can't argue with God. That's an authority. It's a showstopper. I used to say, okay, well, guess we're done here. Inside my head, I would never say that. But it's like, okay, well, that's the end of that conversation. Because the implicit message, again, the hidden little message is wrapped up in that is, you'd better handle this. You can't argue with God. And I want you to stop grieving as a result. And so half the time it felt arrogant and like this person was now advising me on spiritual beliefs. And I was down here and they were up here. And what I was looking for when I was grieving was parity. And so I already am thinking that I'm down here. If anything, I want the reassurance that I'm just like you, not by you saying reassuring things, but by you listening to me and what I have to say without giving advice and with some empathy and hanging in there with me is what shows me that I'm okay. Now, in the end, each of us is responsible for our own self-esteem. But when you're grieving, you need help, more help than normal with that. And you can't rush in and say, well, you're a good person, you need to remember that. You have to show it by being there and listening and standing by me in my ugliest parts and not having it phase you. And that is how you show support to someone who's grieving.
Mm-hmm. So the pep talk would be the last one we were talking about.
Yeah.
Well, and similar to that then is God must have wanted him in heaven or her in heaven.
Yeah.
Well, like more than you wanted, or
Right.
somehow
And
you didn't deserve.
right. So I didn't deserve this, or that consoles me. How exactly? Because I'm still missing my baby, not having a person to shower love on. I have to, and grief is a process of getting accustomed to your new life. It's grieving all the things you had or thought you would have until you form something else. I didn't want to go back to being a childless couple. We had worked 4 long years to have a baby.
You touched on advice too, and oftentimes there's a dismissive element to, well, you need to get over it.
Yes. So someone asked me, how are you? I tell them, I burst into tears, and they interrupt me to say, Dana, you're just going to have to get over this. And so, and that was way more common than you can imagine. So advice does this too. And anytime I give advice to you, I'm raising myself up as I'm now some kind of mini authority on what it is. And I'm talking about unsolicited advice. If I've asked you for advice, then it's like this. But if you're giving advice without it being asked, it does this. Or it mainly pushes this person down and puts you up. And again, as a griever, I'm looking for this because I really need to be met on my own territory, because I can't come to you. I can't put on that armor. Oh gosh, I wished I could have. I wanted to be able to engage in lighthearted banter more than anything in the world. I missed that frivolity. I couldn't. So I can't come to you. You have to meet me where I am if the gap is going to be small. Well, you can always go back and say, hey, forget I said that. If I had to do it again, I would say this. And when the few people who said that to me, it was like, oh, thank you. Bless you. All is forgiven. I'm just so glad someone gets it.
You get to the issue of respect in the
Yes.
book. And, yeah, that flip, how are you, as opposed to a hand on the forearm or something
Mm-hmm.
like that, that really says, I expect I know the answer, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm here with you regardless.
Yeah.
There's a level of respect there that seems, especially when we're sort of flippantly conventional,
Well, and
or lack of respect is what I'm saying.
there are things that we don't even know are disrespectful. Like giving advice is disrespectful because it assumes that we know more than they do about how they should grieve. I have this phrase in my book, paying our respects with respect. If you ask a question to show that you would like to include your grieving friend in an outing, would you like to come? We're having a couple of the guys over for dinner to watch the game. Would you like to come? If they say no, and you say, really, are you sure? That's saying, I don't trust that you know the best answer for yourself. And we need to accept the answer they give us. So when we weigh in, we're saying, I think I know more than you do. And it's really a put down to the griever at a time when they need buoying up.
Well, in the time remaining, let's talk about what you can say.
I'm so glad you asked. So there's no specific words that are good words and no specific words that are bad words.
So you have no pat answers.
Right. I do have an answer. Just in the same way I'm telling you, there's not a specific phrase that you should avoid. There's types of condolences that you should avoid. Well, the types of condolences that help are when we are vulnerable and we are speaking from our heart. And the way we can do that, because we go through our day, we're not expecting to run into someone who's grieving in like the hardware store. We're just there on a project. We can touch our hearts, and that will remind us to shift gears. We can take a little look at our nervousness, and in seeing, oh, I'm a little nervous, it starts to fade, and our guard drops a little bit. And it's your version of, I'm so sorry, I don't know what to say. That's all there is to say. I love you. I'm here for you. Make an offer of something you'd like to do for them. Don't ask them, what can I do for you? Because then you're asking them to figure it out for you. I'd like to, I'm going to Costco on Wednesday, tell them the date, and I'd like to know if I can bring you back some lasagna, tell them what it is, or some of this, or if there's anything else you like, because that informs the griever. Oh, they're going to be bringing a bunch of frozen food home. I can ask for frozen food. Oh, they're going to be bringing a bunch of Kleenex and toilet paper. I can ask for a case of Kleenex. I need like a truckload of Kleenex. So anything that is from your heart. And yeah, that's such a pat phrase that it can be difficult to figure out when we are not in our hearts. But if we can say the riskiest, scariest thing, like, oh my God, I just don't know what to do. I wish I knew what to do, without laying it on them, like, here, help me make me feel better. But just adult to adult, I wish there was a way I could save you from any of this pain, but I know I can't. I'm with you, whatever it takes, anything.
So a phrase, looking at sort of the obverse and the reverse of it, a phrase like, I know what you're going through, when obviously you don't,
Right. Even if,
is
go ahead, I'm sorry.
is very different than, I can't imagine what you're going through. I am so
Yes,
sorry.
that's perfect. But what I'd like to leave with is that every single person is mentally and emotionally and physically capable of giving condolences, consolation that is meaningful. You don't have to be an expert. You have to be brave enough to reach out immediately. Put your own reservations aside. Oh, I'm too embarrassed. Well, what do I care more about? Saving face or helping my friend and potentially looking stupid? Anyone can make a huge difference by showing up and revealing their heart. I can't even imagine how hard this is. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dana. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thank you, Rick. This has been really wonderful, and I appreciate this.
Fantastic. And again, the book is The Condolence Pocket Guide by Dana Lacy Amarisa.